From the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War, what do we understand by that? What is our understanding? What is our analysis? And what can we take away from this important shift which has just happened? So before we do anything, let's begin as usual. Peace and love, freedom and decolonization to all African people, those at home, those abroad, and those in the future. If you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have two trousers, please sell one and buy a sword. Because now it is time for revolution, and this revolution is no longer on the streets. This revolution is not about burning cars to make demands, but this revolution is about building our own cars to make our own money and to change our own situation. Essentially, we say that this revolution is in the mind, because if we are not in charge of our mind, the enemy will be in charge of our mind, of course, and in charge of our bodies and transform us into tools of self-oppression. Once again, receive our revolutionary greetings from the African Continental Unity Party. My name is King Kabbalah from ACUP, and I'm happy as always to have you on this session where we talk about Africa. We talk about our agenda, which is the liberating agenda. Today we're talking about the change or the shift from the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War. Of course, everyone, if you have listened to the news recently, you will know that the United States, the President Trump of the US, has renamed the normally known as the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War. Of course, I understand that this is something that existed in the past during the Second World War, somewhere around there. But the question or questions that we have to ask about this change, and of course after that a lesson or lessons that we can learn as African people as far as we are concerned, because if we have to use the principle of hermetic, which says that as it is below, as it is above, or in other words, as it is above, it is below. So what happens with those or with these so-called superpower countries in the world also affect us directly or indirectly, simply because our economies, our politics, our leadership, our ideologies are always, in most cases, connected or linked or aligned with them. So what happens with them affects us as well. That's why we need to understand what is the meaning of this move. Is it just a symbolic change, or it is actually a strategic repositioning of the United States with regard to other countries of the world? So we need to understand that, and by understanding that, we need to come up with a lesson or lessons that will help us to sharpen our own politics, especially for the uprising leaders, the upcoming leaders that we have on the continent, so that we have a certain mindset that will allow us to avoid the shame in which we have been put by the current leadership on the continent. That's very important. So why renaming the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War? And actually, before even we talk about it, I think we need to listen to the comment or the speech that was made by the Secretary of Defense in the US, as Trump was just affecting or, of course, sanctioning this change. After listening to him, then we can make a comment, we can analyze, we can try to understand from a revolutionary Pan-African perspective, and of course, as I said, draw our lessons, our takeaways, and eventually take our own position as African people to make sure that this revolution that we've started has to be a success for us and for our children. Now, listen to the Minister of Defense, or now the Minister of War of the United States of America.
That this name change is not just about renaming, it's about restoring. Words matter. It's restoring, as you've guided us to, Mr. President, restoring the warrior ethos, restoring victory and clarity as an end state, restoring intentionality to the use of force. So at your direction, Mr. President, the War Department is going to fight decisively, not endless conflicts. It's going to fight to win, not to lose. We're going to go on offense, not just on defense. Maximum lethality, not tepid legality. Violent effect, not politically correct. We're going to raise up warriors, not just defenders.
Now, having listened to him, having said all that I've said in the beginning, I think it's important to ask some questions. The first question that I need to ask is, when America renames its Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War, who does America propose to fight against? And I think this is a simple question. It's a simple one, and anyone can answer to that, because of course we know China, we know Russia, and other emerging countries in the world, such as India, so forth and so on. So potentially these are the countries that America can prepare a war for, or a war against. Now, the second question that I'm asking is this just a symbolic change, or it is actually an effective strategic move? And I think, as you listened to the speech made by the ministry, or the Minister of Defense, or now Minister of War, it is clear that this is not just a symbolic change, but it is actually a strategic repositioning of the United States with regard to other countries when it comes to defense or war. So in other words, it's no longer about standing on a defensive position. It's actually taking what we call an offensive approach toward other countries. So it means taking the approach which is called the proactive when it comes to war. You have to attack if you detect that your enemy has an intention to attack you in the future, and you are able to attack him today and to destabilize him. You can just take that proactive act and then destroy your enemy. But let's put that aside. The question that I have to ask again, I guess the important question is, why does America changes now its position, militarily speaking, from defensive to offensive, right? From Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of War. Why? And this is where I want us to take a little bit of time to analyze. The first thing that I want to make as a statement about this is that anything that in this world is gained through violence and war can only be maintained through violence and war. Equally, anything that you lose through violence, war, and brutality, you can only recuperate it by the same means that you have lost it. So in other words, if you have invaded people, you have conquered them, you have destroyed the capability, and you have taken possession of what belongs to them, it's only through the same means of force, brutality, violence that you will be able to keep those people subjected to your authority, and eventually controlling their belongings. And for those people, because they have lost what they had through violence and war, the only way they can be able to recuperate what they have lost to you is through violence and war. Now, this brings me back to talk a bit about America and how it became the United States of America, one of the, or I should say, the most sophisticated and powerful country in the world. We know the genesis of America. It's born out of the genocide of the indigenous people in America, the Indians, as sometimes they are called. And we know the rise of America to its position as a powerful trading country, or manufacturing industry, or manufacturing hub of the world, so forth and so on, is because they had to use a free labor of slaves. So the whole upbringing of the America has been through violence, exploitation, and extermination of other people to have the America that we have today. And it maintained this position by making sure that all other countries that are trying to rise are destroyed. And you have had those situations, the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Africa, we're talking about Libya. And of course, we have a situation where if there's no war, it means there's a leadership which is lenient towards the American position and ideology. So then you don't have a war because you have already what the Americans want, which is to control the resources and take what Africa produces, the best of what Africa produces, and leave Africa, of course, in precarious conditions in which we are today. So this has been all through violence. You can talk about moral violence, military violence. That's why I talk about sanctions. All these strategies, violent strategies, barbaric strategies that Americans use in order to control the world. In fact, there was a poll some years ago. This is reported by Noam Chomsky in his book. There was a poll run worldwide to determine what is the biggest terrorist state in the world. And of course, without surprise, it was the United States of America, which was designated, right, as the biggest as the biggest terrorist organization in the world. I'm talking about the United States government. It was designated as the biggest terrorist organization in the world, followed by Pakistan. Of course, that can be explained because when we have about a billion people in India designating Pakistan as the biggest terrorist organization in the world, it makes sense that this Pakistan was second after the United States. But the point is, America has gained its prominence, its position in the world through violence and war, and it maintains this position by the same means. So the rise of China, the rise of Russia, the rise of India, and potentially the rise of Africa and other Arabic countries poses a threat to the American position. And for the United States of America to reaffirm their position again in the world as the superpower of the world, or for them to lose their position, there has to be war. Whether you like it or not, there has to be a war. In other words, the United States will never accept to lose its position in the world without fighting, without resisting, without really trying to do its best, to do the best they can do to maintain their position. And that is only ultimately through violence and wars. At this point, there's no dialogue, there's no negotiation, there's no deal that will solve this problem, unless if that deal implies that one country such as China, Russia, accepts to remain in a position of domination, of subjugation, and most importantly, to remain exposed to the United States plunder of their resources, which I believe Chinese are not willing to accept, as well as the Russians, and I firmly believe that even Africans should not allow themselves to be exploited, to be plundered, to have their resources being controlled by foreigners. Unfortunately, because we are still divided and tribalistic, microethnistic, lenient, so we all allow ourselves to be exploited and to be ruled by foreigners. But the point is, the Americans understand that they are being threatened as we're speaking right now, and they are preparing for war in order to protect their position in the world, in order to maintain their status in the world. So the last question that I have is, now, not what America wants or does not want, is about us as African people. What do we want, right? If Americans are fighting, are preparing for war, if Chinese have been preparing for war, if all these nations are preparing for war, the question is, the war is over what? And the simple answer is that the war they are preparing for is over African resources, because If you are clever enough, as I am, you will understand that whoever in this world is able to control the resources of Africa is equally able to control the world, and that's reality. So this whole thing is turning around African resources, African land and its resources, right? This is what is happening. So if the world is preparing to go to war for Africa, the question is, what do we do as African people in that regard to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves and protect our resources and defend them, and making sure that these resources can begin to benefit the African people of today and most importantly, the African people of tomorrow? What do we do? When you look at African Union, which is apparently supposed to be an institution that must be speaking for the interest of African people, you are almost surprised because you will realize that they don't talk about the security of the continent. There's no discussion about the security of the continent. There's no discussion about the power, that the military power that the continent needs to have or to build. And importantly, there's no talk at the African Union about the war. Look, we were colonized through war. We were enslaved through war. We are today neo-colonized through war and violence, right? Libya can remind you about it. So how do we think that we will be able to suddenly develop, or developing is actually even a silly word. Let's say, how do we believe that we will be able to liberate ourselves without preparing for war? Important question. Do we really believe that Africa will be delivered or liberated by the willingness of the Western man who has been depending on our exploitation for centuries to build his economy? That is foolishness. And that's the reason why Marcus Garvey said that the Western man has built his standards of living through the exploitation of the men of color, of other race, right? Particularly the African race. And there's no way in this world or in the future world that the white man will suddenly stop oppressing you because of a goodwill or change of mind or something that happens to his psychology. That is not going to happen, right? The only way he will stop oppressing us, he will stop exploiting our lands, our resources, and our people, is when we are able to stand up and to say to him, enough is enough. And this is something that we are still waiting to see done at the African Union. And we don't see even the tendency, even the wish to do something like that. You see, Marcus Garvey said again that the man has become so deviant, so that we cannot convince him by moral and physical truth alone, but only with that which is powerful, the instrument of violence. Violence is the only language that the Western man understands, because it's the language that has allowed him to conquer the rest of the world and to control their resources. It is violence that the French used to control the West Africa, the old Francophone zone. It is the violence that the Americans have used to control the world. So there's no way that suddenly these people will stop violating you, your land, and your people because you are speaking good English or good French, or you have democracy, human rights. I mean, this is a nonsensical mindset that we still have on the continent. I think we need to wake up to the reality and realize that the revolution that we're talking about is bloody, it's violent, and it's brutal. And it is the only way, the only get past toward our complete freedom and liberation. Because if we were taken into captivity through violence, if we were colonized through violence, if our lands, our resources were confiscated through violence, if our history was erased through violence, there's no way that we will lift ourselves up by not using the same equivalent forces that have put us down to lift us up. There's no way. If a man uses force to put you down, physically and scientifically, you got to use the same force but in a different direction to rise yourself up, not by prayer, not by wish, or not by democracy or human rights. It's only when you are able to utilize the equivalence of the same forces that have put you down that you'll be able to rise yourself from the ashes, from where you have been put in the conditions of misery, suffering, where you have been forced to live, and rise again and look at your enemy in the face and declare your freedom, your liberation, and your rights, whatever those rights will be. So these are the things that we want to see, and for you to realize that African Union is not even ready to begin thinking about these things. You will see that recently they've been talking about the change of the map, of the MacArthur map, which has been corrupting African minds because it reduces the size of the continent compared to the American Russians, so forth and so on. But you will see that African Union is appealing, is demanding, is asking for the world to change the MacArthur map. So in other words, we are not capable of deciding what we want to do or how we want to be recognized by the world. Why can't we just move on to change the size of the map by ourselves, or to create our own maps that reflects the grandeur or the size of Africa, and tell the world that this is what we are going to use? So I think we have to forget about African Union. But for all those upcoming leaders, the important message is that there's no way that we will liberate the continent without preparing for war. And this is the right time that Pan-Africanism is really useful, because Pan-Africanism allows us to come together to build a continental army, or a defense system, so that we are able to protect not one country but to protect the whole continent. And this is very important. And we are appealing to all African people around the world, particularly on the continent, to begin voting into power Pan-Africanist, because all these things can be possible only when we have Pan-Africanists in power. If we are still voting for the leaders who have been cooked and prepared in the West to come and run the Western business in Africa, we are going to wait for a long time before we can see a significant change towards unity and consolidation of our efforts to build the United States of Africa that we are all talking about, or that we wish to see on the continent. So, peace and love, freedom and decolonization to all African people, those at home, those abroad, and those in the future. If you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword, because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is not on the streets, this revolution is in the mind. Once again, receive our revolutionary greetings, and we see you next time. Bye bye.